Red Sails to Capri, Chapter 10, Part 2. Without a word, Michael picked up his oars and began to row. Without a word, he shipped his oars and dived into the water at the opening of the cave. Without a word, Signor Pagano and Pietro stretched themselves out on the bottom of the boat. Michael started to swim, pushing the boat before him. Swish! A great suction seemed to draw them in. 1 minute they were outside with all the waters of the bay around them. The next minute they were inside the cave. No, not inside the cave. Inside another world. They all stared. It was a world made of blue. The light, the water, the rocks, the walls of the cavern, the arched dome. Everything was blue. Blue flames of light leaped across the walls. Blue flames rose from the shimmering water. Whether the flames were hot or cold, no one knew. No one cared. It was too beautiful to believe. They looked around them. Blue was no longer a color. There was something to touch, to smell, to taste, to hear. Even the air they breathed was blue, and their bodies, filled with it, felt light and buoyant. Were they bewitched? Where were they? What was this place? It was eerie and strange and gloriously wonderful. The light, the air, the water, the rocks, all were made of the same material. Blue! Blue was the substance of everything. Only the shades were different. The air was light blue. The light, lighter blue. The water was deep blue. The rocks, darker. Then suddenly, the blue was tinged with silver. Every ripple was edged with gleaming bubbles. Every wave carried with it a trail of spangles. The boats, the oars, the hands of the men when they dipped them into the water, all were outlined with a spray of diamonds. It was a world of magic. No one spoke. They sat as if enchanted. The monsters, the pirates, the man-eating fish, all had vanished. In their place was a fairyland that twinkled and gleamed, sparkled and danced like a flaming sapphire. They were in the midst of a miracle. Then Herr Nordstrom began to speak. He spoke softly, as if fearful of disturbing the blue. Look! He pointed to some steps at the end of the cavern. See those steps go down under the water. Surely they were not always like that. This cavern, this grotto, has all been changed. An earthquake many years ago must have caused it to sink. Perhaps that was the beginning of the wild tales about it. I don't know. Perhaps no one will ever know. It is easy to see how these blue flames of light, seen from the outside, would be very frightening. He looked around him. Most of the monsters men fear are in their minds. They would vanish like smoke if we would only let them. See, he pointed to the mouth of the cave. The opening is very small. Almost all the light that enters must pass through the water. Since the water is blue, the light is blue, and everything it touches becomes blue also. It is a gift that nature has made for Capri. Monsieur Jacques shook his head. I have traveled all over the world, he said. I have seen wonderful things, but nothing I have seen compares with this. The whole world will come to Capri to see it. He smiled at Signor Pagano. Remember, he said, remember? I said I came to Capri in search of adventure. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect to find an adventure as wonderful as this. Lord Derby shook his head. Remember, he said, I said I came to Capri in search of beauty. Beauty! He looked around him. No one in the world has ever seen anything more beautiful than this. Herr Nordstrom smiled. I will tell you, he said, what all philosophers know. The search for truth is always an adventure, and there is always beauty in the truth itself. To have knowledge and understanding, to know the truth about things, that can be as exciting and beautiful as this blue cavern, this blue grotto. He looked at Michael and smiled. Does this help you understand the meaning of philosophy? Michael nodded his head, but before he had time to answer, Angelo's voice filled the grotto. Come, we must hurry. Hurry? Why? Everyone started at Angelo. Why should they hurry? The tide would not be high enough to cover the entrance for at least 3 hours. Stupidos! Angelo waved his hands in the air. Don't you want to tell the people of Capri what we have found? If we hurry, they will have time to come here this afternoon. Angelo stopped talking and smiled to himself. What do you think they will say? How will they act? Hurry, I can't wait to see their faces. As they rowed back to the Grand Marina pier, they made plans. Michael, as soon as they landed, was to run to the inn, tell Signora Pagano what had happened, and bring her to the piazza in front of the church. Angelo was to find the priest and have him ring the church bells. The others were to moor the boats and then go to the piazza. The village priest was standing in the doorway of the church when Angelo appeared. He saw that Angelo was excited and wondered why he was running, but he was completely unprepared for Angelo's violent outburst. The bells! Angelo shouted to him from the road. The bells! Ring them! Ring the bells? The priest stared. Why? What has happened? An accident? A death? A drowning? By this time, Angelo had crossed the piazza and was at the foot of the steps. What is it? The priest called down to him. Tell me, Angelo. There is no time. Angelo raced up the steps. Every minute is precious. Ring the bells, I beg you. The priest did not move. I cannot ring the bells, Angelo, until I know what has happened. Now it was Angelo's turn to stare. There was not time to tell this story twice. Once to the priest and again to the people. The tide was rising every minute. Please, Angelo spread his hands in supplication. Please ring the bells. When everyone is assembled, I will tell you altogether what has happened. Still, the priest did not move. The bells are rung for services, for weddings, when someone has died, and for catastrophes, he repeated. I cannot ring the bells until I know what has happened. Angelo rushed past the priest and into the church. I know what has happened, he called back over his shoulder, so I can ring them. And before the priest could stop him, he entered the bell chamber and began to pull on the ropes. Never had Capri heard such bell ringing. Each villager, as he rushed from his house, was sure he, his family, and the bell ringer were the only living survivors on the island. For surely nothing less than a complete catastrophe would bring forth such a din. Had there been an earthquake, a tidal wave? Had the island been invaded? Everyone hurried to the piazza. Louder and louder the bells rang. Angelo pulled hard at the ropes, could not hear the sharp protests of the priest, and since his back was turned toward the door, could not see him either. Angelo! Angelo! The priest shouted, waving his arms, but the only answer he got was the ringing of the bells, louder and louder. Not until the piazza was filled with people did Angelo stop. At least he stopped pulling the ropes, but in his own ears the bells continued to ring. He could hear them as he hurried through the church. He could hear them when he stood at the top of the steps and motioned for silence. He could still hear them ringing when he started to talk. People of Capri, he said. At least he hoped that's what he said. That was what he meant to say. Those were the words his lips formed, but he himself could hear nothing. As quickly as possible, he told them what had happened. It didn't take long. Then he tried to describe to them the beauty of the cave. That was harder to do, but at last he was finished, and as he stopped speaking, the ringing too seemed to stop. Now there was silence everywhere. It was a strange silence. Angelo looked from one face to another questioningly. Where were the shouts of joy? Where were the congratulations? Why didn't the people look pleased, happy, excited? This was a moment for rejoicing. Why was everyone silent? At last the silence was broken, but not in the way Angelo had expected. The people whispered and murmured to each other. They looked angry and displeased. Then suddenly the murmurings grew louder, the voices more shrill. Still standing at the top of the steps, Angelo could hear what they were saying. This is some wild dream of Angelo's. This is a joke, and a bad one at that. It's a trick he's played on us. Look, even the priest is angry. He glares at Angelo. Angelo has told some big stories in his day, but nothing as bad as this. To mention the cove is bad enough, but to say that he went there. How does he dare? And on the steps of the church, too. And before the priest, and on Sunday. The murmurings grew louder and louder. Then, turning their backs on Angelo, the people began to leave the piazza. It was then that Signora Pagano, who had been waiting with Michael at the edge of the crowd, hurried forward. She ran up the church steps and, standing beside Angelo, said in a firm voice, "Stop! Wait a minute!" It was surprising how well her voice carried. Everyone heard her and turned around. They stared at her questioningly. What was she doing there beside Angelo? What did she want to say? Signora Pagano had never spoken to a crowd of people before, but she didn't think of that as she stood there at the top of the steps. She had heard from Michael the same story Angelo had told, and she knew it was true. The men had gone to the cove and returned safely. That in itself was wonderful. But wonderful, too, had been the look on Michael's face when he told her what they had seen. So much beauty was unbelievable. But if Michael said it was there, she was ready to believe it. But the people didn't believe it. They were turning away from Angelo with angry words. She had heard sharp threats and dangerous mutterings as she hurried through the crowd. Something had to be done, and quickly. In the same quiet, firm voice, Signora Pagano began to speak to the people in the piazza. She told them how Herr Nordstrom had insisted upon going to the cove. She told them how the past month had been filled with plans and work and worry. She told them how the 5 men and 2 boys had gone off that morning in 3 boats, and how they had all returned safe and sound and full of wonder. Then, taking Angelo's hand, she smiled up at him and said, "Come, Angelo, show me your cave." Once more the people were silent. Signora Pagano, her head held high and her hand in Angelo's arm, walked down the steps, across the piazza, and onto the road. This was the start of a strange procession. First, there were Signora Pagano and Angelo leading the way. Then came the 3 guests, Signor Pagano, Michael, and Pietro, looking very pleased with themselves. And behind them followed the people of Capri, as if bewitched. Down the steep path to the Grand Marina pier they walked. No one spoke. Tension and excitement hung around them. Arriving at the pier, Angelo and Signora Pagano got into the first boat. The 3 guests, Michael and Pietro, climbed into the other 2. The crowd, waiting on the pier, watched them row fearlessly out toward the mysterious cove. The cove, however, is some distance from the Grand Marina pier. The waiting crowd would need boats too if they were really to see this strange expedition. Instantly, every fisherman thought of his own boat tied to the pier, and the scramble that followed was a sight to see. Never on Capri had fishermen's boats been so highly valued. Never had fishermen's families felt so superior. In a few minutes, the pier was almost empty and every boat was filled. Still in the same order, the procession had transferred itself to the water. When the first 3 boats entered the cove, the other boats formed a wide arc out in the bay. It was as if, with their semicircle of boats, the fishermen were outlining the wide berth they had given the cove for so many years. It was all like a special performance. The cove was the stage. The first 3 boats were the scenery. Their occupants were the actors, and the people of Capri, seated in their boats, were certainly a most attentive audience. One by one, the 3 boats disappeared into the cave. The people of Capri, watching and waiting, were still silent. Seconds took on the length of hours. Would the boats never appear again? Why didn't they come out? What was keeping them inside that cave? Then slowly, the bow of a boat appeared, and a second later the smiling face of Signora Pagano emerged from the bottom of the boat. Like the main actress in a play, she nodded and smiled at her audience, and the audience, delighted to see her, shouted and cheered. Then, as if it had all been prearranged, the people in the first 3 boats on the right of the semicircle started toward the cove. They went in and out again, and as they reappeared, their faces showed plainly the wonder they had seen. Now at last, The gay mood which Angelo had expected enveloped the crowd. People laughed and talked. Men called from boat to boat. Children shouted and cheered. A song was started, and 100 voices joined in the chorus. Soon, everyone was singing. 3 by 3, the boats continued to take their turns, and with every trip, the hilarity mounted. Never had Capri seen such gay rejoicing. The last boat got out of the grotto just in time, after the high tide waters lapped around the top of the entrance, almost hiding it from view. Now the curtains were closed. The performance was over. But the crowd was still gay. This they knew was not the end. It was instead just the beginning. It was indeed just the beginning. From the east and the west, from the north and the south, by ones and twos, by tens and twenties, by hundreds and thousands, people have come to see this wonder. And each day the tides open wide the entrance and reveal again one of the most beautiful places in all the world, the famous Blue Grotto on the island of Capri. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. And please come back for our next book. We'll be reading another one real soon. Please reach down, click like, and subscribe to our channel. I love you guys, and as Tigger says, ta-ta for now.